Thank you very much, Ines. I hope you can hear me well. My name is Martin Forsberg, and I will introduce this concept of the Core Invoice Usage Specifications. I will also mention a little bit about extensions, as they are somewhat related. And then I will hand over to Siv, and she will present how the PEPPOL CIUS is designed and some of the choices made in the PEPPOL CIUS. So I hope that most of you are familiar with the European standard and the Core Invoice Data Model. We will not do a general introduction of that today. We will specifically talk about usage specifications and consequences of those. So so let's get started. So the idea with the core is that to have something in common between all the buyers and sellers in Europe. The core is contextualized for European needs, for VAT, and for typical European aspects. Not necessarily only European, but with the European VAT specifically in mind. We have the international standards such as cross-industry invoicing UBL, which the core is syntax bound to. These standards are very, very, let's say, expressive and contains tens of thousands of potential elements to use or business terms to use. The core is less than 200 business terms. So the core gives like a small subset of these international standards to be used for exchanging invoices. The idea with the core is also that it's supposed to be possible to use as is. It should be easy to implement, and the idea is also that it will be covering most or all of typical situations. However, it was also understood, of course, since we're only talking about a handful of business terms, or less than 200, there will be situations where the core isn't sufficient. Could be that in specific industries, you might need to have more information. For example, on the product in the steel industry, you might have more specific qualified business terms for product information. And so on, and this goes for many industries and sectors where you might want to extend. So the standards from TC434 also allows for a methodology for how to add business terms on top of the core, so that you can create an extension. So this is one of the mechanisms within the European standard. So that is extensions. These needs to be, we'll say, bilaterally agreed, or they need to be agreed between the buyers and the sellers that this is on top of the core. But there is also one more thing, the topic of the day, the Core Invoice Usage Specification. And Core Invoice Usage Specification allows a more restrictive or refined specification based on the core as a starting point. It looks kind of dramatic in my illustration here, where this yellow circle is quite small, but essentially what the user specification makes possible is to add, for example, domestic rules on top of the core. It's important also to mention that a user specification must be a true subset. It doesn't allow that a user specification must not extend. So it's only additional rules or restrictions on top of the core. So that is an important distinction. And looking at what is allowed to do in a Core Invoice User Specification and an extension, and I've taken these from the standard itself. First of all, it's important also to underline now that even though these types of restrictions, which I will mention soon, are possible in a user specification, it doesn't mean that they are good ideas to do, because as we will get to, they may hamper interoperability and cause problems depending on how they are applied. But technically, if you want to create a true subset of a model, there are a few things that you can do. And on the left, in the left column here, we see these types of restrictions, which will result in a true subset, such as you can restrict, so you forbid some elements which are optional. You can make a definition narrower. It's possible to add synonyms or explanatory text in the CIUS. An optional element can be made mandatory. The limitation of number of repetitions to make data types narrower in their representation. So, for example, making alphanumeric data types numeric, and limit the allowed code values. So, if the business term allows for 100 different code values, the CIUS could limit that into a specific set of code values, and add additional business rules, which makes the model more restrictive. Restrict field length and certain formatting of values, and restrict decimal fractions. So, of course, looking at this as user specification, which is deploying all of these types of restrictions, will of course be quite a different animal compared to the core. So therefore, it's important to be very, very cautious when using these. But the reason why they're here is that they are a logical consequence of the fact that if you want to create a true subset, these are the possible ways of creating that. So, on the other hand, on the extensions, it's possible to make a definition wider, make mandatory element optional, increase allowed number of repetitions, add code values. So it's really just extending. So let's see. I saw that we got a question already now. Do we want to, Ines? Do we want to bring them up directly, or should we?
So yeah, maybe we can keep it until the end of the webinar, so
okay.
We can answer at the end.
All right. If you make a note on which slide the comment was posted on. So then the European standard defines these concepts of compliant and conformance, and this is something that may be synonyms for most people, compliance and conformance, but the European standard is making a difference between those two words. So that's important to keep in mind. Compliant means that some or all features of the core invoice models are used and all rules of the core invoice models are respected. So that is compliant. And conformance, that all rules of the core invoice models are respected and some additional features not defined in the core models are also used. So these concepts, they are derived partly from TOGAF, which have these as when deploying an architecture. If it's compliant, you're using all or some of the features. If it's conformant, you use all or adding on top of it. So it's important to remember that the compliant and conformant has slightly different meaning within the context of this standard. And the compliant is what is related to Core Invoice Usage Specifications. Also, these words can be found in the directive itself. In Article 7, it says that receipt and processing of electronic invoices, the member states shall ensure that the contracting authorities receive and process electronic invoices which comply with the European standard on electronic invoicing. So here we find the word comply, and this was also one of the reasons why TC434 wanted to use the word comply in the context of European standard. So this can be read that you have to support invoices that comply with European standard. Furthermore, if we go back to the European standard in Chapter 4, we'll find some definitions. For example, what does it mean for a receiving party to claim compliance? So when can I claim compliance? And here it says that a receiving party may only claim compliance to the core invoice model if it accepts invoices that comply with the core invoice model in general, or with a CIUS that itself is compliant with the core invoice model. So what this means is that if I, as a receiver, want to claim compliance to the European standard, I can either implement the standard in general, or I implement a CIUS. So this little "or" is what makes CIUSes such an interesting question, and also a reason for why it's being debated a lot, whether or not it's a good idea. But it's a consequence of the way that TC434 developed the standard, and also how it's designed. So it's kind of have the CIUS concept in mind. So let's continue. Some consequences of this. Let's say that a buyer, which we have on the right side here, this buyer, she has implemented European standard fully with all features described in the model. It can present all code values. It can use all the invoice type codes. It implemented the European standard completely with all its features. Sorry. On the left side, we have suppliers who has independently implemented the European standard. The first one has implemented the standard as is, based on the available specifications. Then we have two other suppliers. One has implemented a CIUS X, and the other one has implemented CIUS Y. X and Y, these have some restrictions in them. Perhaps a few elements are mandatory. And finally, the last supplier here has used an extended version of the European standard and implemented that. So he may be using additional code values which are not mentioned in the standard. So consequences of this, when they send invoices, is that for the first situation, that all instances which the first supplier issues should be possible to accept for the receiver, as he is following the standard as is. The two other ones, the CIUS X and CIUS Y, all of these invoices should also be possible to accept, since they are using a true subset of the standard. It's not violating any of the rules within the standard. But the fourth supplier, he may be violating the rules of the standard, or is using features which are not mentioned, which means that the supplier may not necessarily receive them, since they are not necessarily compliant to the standard, only conformant. So this is a few scenarios where the receiver supports the EN fully. We have another scenario where the receiver supports a CIUS specifically, only one, and that makes the situation a little bit more tricky. Let's say that the CIUS X has made a restriction on a code list, or made an element mandatory. For example, the reference to the buyer or the order reference is mandatory. So let's say that what happens now when the suppliers send their invoices. The first one who implemented the European standard completely may not respect the restrictions defined in the CIUS X. And in those cases where he's not following those restrictions, the invoice will not be found to be compliant to the CIUS, and therefore the receiver can't process them. The second supplier, that's a given. They are using the same CIUS. The third one is the same thing that could happen there. They are using different restrictions, and the same for the one with the extensions. So I think these scenarios clearly presents that there are some interoperability issues being introduced by the CIUS concept. However, there are quite good reasons to actually use CIUSs in some cases. The European standard have some areas which are not completely documented, or where there are some areas where it says, for example, that further negotiation or further details need to be documented around some processes, for example. So CIUSs is a reality, and but there are an understanding of that. They introduce interoperability challenges, and a proliferation of CIUSs will hamper, particularly cross-border interoperability. A typical example could be that, let's say, in a specific country, there is a CIUS that makes some restrictions on the supplier's organization number. So you must provide your organization number, or it has to have this particular pattern. So it has to be 10 digits. It has to be prefixed with this character or something like that. Those type of restrictions may not be very problematic within that country, but cross-border, they will cause problems, of course, because someone else is implementing the standard without knowledge of those restrictions, and those restrictions might not even be valid for a supplier from another country. So there are risks involved here. There are several initiatives to avoid unnecessary proliferation of CIUSs. Guidance and recommendations are being prepared on keeping CIUSs to a minimum. There are initiatives on having central registration of CIUSs and extensions, particularly to help implementers get a picture and understanding of what they might have to implement. And also there are structured approaches on how to document and define the CIUSs. I'll come back to that in a moment. The CEF team realized, and the CEF community realized quite early on, that some kind of registry is useful to both track the development of CIUSs, but also to help implementers. So what the CEF community has on the community pages, you might have seen this, is what's called community-driven registry of CIUSs and extensions, which is the content of this registry. It's essentially a list of CIUSs. These are maintained by the community itself. So if you are working on a CIUS project, you can just log in with your user account on CEF Digital and add your project here. So there is it's not claimed to be a complete picture, and there is no specific requirements on how to register. So this was an initiative to just start capturing this information. Currently, there are 11 projects from 7 countries and PEPPOL on this list. Some countries are developing several CIUSs, and some of these are led by public sector initiatives. So it's kind of a domestic CIUS, but there are others which are made from different other types of communities or groups. Currently, 3 of the CIUSs have been published and are what's called the state active, and the rest are currently being planned or in development. And what I've understood, there have been entries on this list which has been deleted later on when the group decided to not continue with it if the plan changes. So this is more of the community-driven registry that we currently have at the CEF Digital web pages. It is freely. If you Google CEF Digital CIUS, you will probably have this page as the first hit at Google. Then there is a more formal approach too. We have development within the CEN TC434, the technical committee which has developed and is maintaining the European standard. There is a new work item which has been approved. It's called Methodology for the Development of Use of the Standard Compliant Core Invoice Usage Specifications. So this it's a new specification that is going to be more of a methodology on how to specify a CIUS in a more structured way, even to create a machine processable format so that CIUSs can be compared and analyzed. That's the idea with the work item. So, and this has been approved. TC434 is also preparing a proposal for the functionality and management of registries of CIUS and extensions. So it's both the functionality and the organization of how such a registry should be maintained. That is not yet. That work has not yet started. It's just the work is now on the proposal for such a work. So, but there are initiatives in TC434, so the work hasn't stopped, so to speak, in that committee. So now it's continuing with this. So with that, I have introduced some of the challenges and some concepts with the CIUSs. And I will now leave the presentation over to Siv, who is going to present the PEPPOL CIUS, the specification used within the PEPPOL infrastructure for exchanging invoices compliant to the European standard. So I'm going to ask Ines to hand over the presentation rights to Siv.
Yeah, so Siv, you should now have the right to control the presentation. Welcome.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.